I'm here today to ask you all to ask yourselves, is healthcare a right or a luxury? It's a vitally important question, but before you respond, allow me to challenge you a little. I'll start with a story. In 2015, I was offered an opportunity to spend a year training in one of the world's best cancer hospitals in the US. This was a huge privilege for me, and I was really excited to go. The only strange thing was, when I was filling out my starting paperwork for the job, I was being asked questions like, did my 2 young kids have any pre-existing illnesses? I was also informed that even if they were completely medically well, I still had to pay about $25,000 a year in health insurance, or I wouldn't be permitted to work there. $25,000. Now, myself being the product of a more socialized public system here in Australia and New Zealand, this was a foreign concept to me. It was a little scary, in fact. The idea that children may not get medically treated if they didn't have the right health insurance organized by their parents. What if they didn't have parents? What if their parents were on the minimum wage? It felt wrong. It felt unfair. And this was in one of the wealthiest democratic nations on the planet. But anyway, I did the needful, got the insurance, flew to the US, and I started work. And this place was absolutely incredible. Cutting-edge medical and surgical services being delivered by some of the most brilliant and most dedicated doctors and nurses in their field. But there was a catch, and it was always looming in the background. The best way to describe it is that this probably truly was the world's best cancer hospital, if you could afford it. And I struggled with this idea. On the one hand, I had seemingly unlimited resources with which to treat patients, which was actually frickin' awesome. I loved it. But it was a bit like a guilty pleasure because I knew that for every patient I treated, another would get rejected because they didn't have insurance or the right level of cover. So one day, I was sitting in the tea room between operations, and I finally blurted out to a colleague of mine, I said, how can you live with yourself as a doctor, knowing that a large segment of your population can't access the care that you provide? Her answer surprised me. She said, the problem you have, Tarek, is you can only really see things from a British colony socialist perspective. She said, you regard healthcare as a birthright and feel that you're automatically entitled to it. But have you ever considered that it may not be a birthright? That in large parts of the world, including here in the US, it's a very expensive luxury. She then went on to say, what makes you think that by being born a citizen of a given nation, that you're automatically entitled to a brand new, big state-of-the-art hospital, the latest medical technology, and the most expensive drugs money can buy, funded by your government and taxes? Don't you see? If that's what you want, then you have to accept rationing and death panels, because there's just no way that any government can pay for high-quality healthcare for all of its citizens. It's simply too expensive. So you have a choice. Crappy, mediocre healthcare for everyone, with long waiting lists, or high-quality healthcare on tap for those that can afford it. I can't lie, I was taken aback a bit by this. I'd never heard it sort of that clearly stated before. But being as stubborn as I am, I decided I'd dig a little deeper. I started researching different healthcare systems around the world. Surely there must be a way to pay for high-quality healthcare for everyone. And that's when I realized she was right. At least partially. You see, in the developed Western world, no matter which country you live in or what kind of healthcare system you have, we are rapidly heading towards the day when our healthcare will be completely and utterly unaffordable. We may even be there already. How did we get here? Well, in some ways, we're a product of our own success. The fundamental issue is this: people are living longer and longer. The median life expectancy in Australia is now well over 80 years old and is continuing to climb. Sounds great. But the problem is, it turns out there is a ceiling to how long a human being can actually live biologically. And that's around 115 years old. We have an expiry date, no matter what science fiction and health tech companies would have you believe. So, as we keep increasing people's ages to try and reach this upper limit, the more and more difficult, and therefore the more and more expensive it gets. Partly because we're fighting a losing battle against biology, but also because we need to sustain and maintain the ever-aging population that continue to use healthcare resources while they're alive. It's like climbing a mountain that gets steeper the higher you climb. So what should we do? Well, the first thing I'll say is this. Don't freak out. There is hope, but it does require participation by each and every one of us. Also, like all difficult problems and all awesome TED Talks, we need a 3-point plan. And I've prepared one earlier just for today. So here we go. Point number 1. Select a system. Select a system. There are 2 basic ways to pay for healthcare. A shared public system, where we fund free healthcare for everyone through taxes, and a private system, where each person pays individually for the healthcare that they need, either directly or through insurance. Which is better? Like most things, there are pros and cons of each. The public system tends to be compassionate and altruistic in that it treats everyone, young and old, rich and poor, equally. But, like most large government institutions, it tends to be quite inefficient and very slow to adapt to change and slow to innovate. The private system, on the other hand, is run like a business, efficient, high volume, revenue generating. But it can also be quite brutal. No money, no product. The truth is, a hybrid system which leverages the advantages of both worlds is probably the best. We're lucky here in Australia because we have one of the most balanced healthcare systems around in terms of funding, and it shows. I promise this is the one and only graph. As you can see, compared to its peers, Australia, which is the graph, the red line on the bottom, actually spends relatively less of its revenue on healthcare, despite having similar, if not better, outcomes in most areas. The US, which is the green line up the top, has a largely privatized system, and the 3 countries clustered in the middle have a more socialist public system. Either extreme becomes less efficient. And our role here is to continue to iterate and innovate and build on what we've got so that we can serve as an example of a balanced, well-funded healthcare model. But enough ego stroking. Let's move on to point number 2 of the 3-point plan, and this is something we are terrible at. Care about cost. That's a picture of me in the photo. I'm the vertically challenged guy on the right, in case you hadn't guessed. You want to know the worst thing about this photo? I'm actually standing on a step stool, and it still looks like me. Anyway, in all seriousness though, in the heat of the moment during surgery, do you think I really care how much the stuff around me costs? If you were that patient on the operating table in the photo, would you want me to be worried about that? Or would you rather I just focus on the task at hand? But you know what? Maybe we should all just grow up a little and start to treat our healthcare dollar like adults instead of kids in a candy store. Maybe as doctors, we should start telling people how much things cost and why. And as patients, maybe we should start listening and stop equating price with quality. And actually, there are plenty of areas where we waste healthcare resources on things that don't do anything at all. A good example of this is wound dressings. We have high-quality evidence that wound dressings, for simple surgical incisions, don't actually do anything. They don't prevent wound infections, they don't improve wound healing, and they don't even contribute to patient satisfaction. It's true. For the most part, all they do is line the pockets of the companies that make them. So, if we're going to be using wound dressings, we should use the cheapest ones available. And that's just one of many, many examples where we could be reducing costs with zero impact on outcomes. Which brings me to the third and final point of the three-point plan. And this one's the most difficult. Quality over quantity. As a society, we need to start prioritizing quality of life over quantity of life. One thing is clear at this point: no one lives forever, and the lucky few live well for the time that they have. We shouldn't have to keep blindly pursuing an ever-increasing lifespan for our population, regardless of cost. It's a losing game, and it's not always right for patients either. Instead, we should focus our energy on improving the quality of the time that we have. This would be much more cost-effective as a policy, but it does require frank and open discussions, particularly around cultural perceptions of life, death, and disability. This is Michael. Michael is 92 years old. He's beaten the odds. He could be your dad or your granddad. Michael also has bowel cancer, and we recently looked after him in hospital. The team did an amazing job, and he was very happy to be included in this talk. Now, when Michael is deciding about whether he wants surgery and chemotherapy, he needs to be allowed the freedom and the space to figure out whether extending his lifespan even further is worth it to him, especially when you consider the negative implications the treatment might have on his ability to function in society. He shouldn't be pressured by us assuming that he wants us to just go in all guns blazing, regardless of the cost to him as a person, simply to extend his lifespan. This quote was recently published in a paper talking about cancer treatment. In it, the goals of treatment are stated as being to prolong survival, yes, but with an acceptable quality of life and at a reasonable cost. So let's go back to the question we posed at the start. Is healthcare a right or a luxury? Let's reflect on that again. If something is a right, but as a society we can no longer afford to pay for it, does it then become a luxury? Maybe the question shouldn't be, how do we define or label healthcare? Maybe the more important question is this: are we as a society willing to make the right choices so that we can continue to achieve those goals going forward for our population? Or are we simply going to stand by and watch while our rights and our luxuries become more and more inaccessible to us? I'll leave that up to you to decide. Thank you. Thank you.